Most people think courage looks loud, but the people who save lives are often the ones who never raise their voices. On a cold Thursday evening just outside downtown Seattle, Victoria Hayes finally stepped away from another 14-hour workday, with the familiar ache behind her eyes that came from too many board meetings and too few honest conversations. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country, she could negotiate billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, but deciding what to eat for dinner somehow felt impossible. Instead of calling for her driver, she slipped behind the wheel herself and headed toward a neighborhood grocery store she barely remembered visiting years earlier. It was one of those ordinary places where fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, shopping carts rattled across worn tile floors, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the air with comforting familiarity. Nobody recognized her, and for once, she preferred it that way. She grabbed a small basket and wandered the aisles without purpose, picking up a carton of milk, a loaf of sourdough bread, and a container of soup she had no intention of cooking herself. Across the store, another customer moved at a completely different pace. Elijah Bennett, dressed in a faded navy work jacket with traces of engine grease around the cuffs, walked beside his 8-year-old son, Caleb. Every few steps the boy stopped to ask another question, and Elijah answered each one with the same patient smile, never rushing him, never checking his phone, never acting as though there was somewhere more important to be. They stood near the checkout lanes counting dollar bills and loose quarters together before paying for a gallon of milk, peanut butter, apples, and a box of oatmeal. "Take your time," Elijah told his son quietly. "Money deserves respect because somebody worked hard to earn every dollar." Caleb nodded with complete seriousness, carefully stacking the bills exactly as his father had shown him. Victoria noticed the exchange without meaning to. There was something strangely calming about watching a father who seemed entirely present in a world that rewarded constant distraction. She caught herself smiling before looking away, embarrassed by the unexpected warmth settling over her thoughts. The automatic doors slid open once more, letting in a gust of cool evening air along with 3 hurried customers wearing hooded sweatshirts. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Shopping carts continued rolling. Cash registers chimed. Someone laughed near the bakery. Then the atmosphere shifted so subtly that almost nobody could explain exactly when it happened. Conversations faded. Cashiers stopped smiling. A silence spread across the front of the store like an invisible wave. Victoria instinctively looked toward the entrance. Elijah did the same, though unlike everyone else, his expression never changed. He simply rested one reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder and leaned down just enough to whisper something only his son could hear. The boy looked up at his father, took a slow breath, and nodded. Whatever Elijah had said erased every trace of fear from Caleb's face. Victoria had spent years studying leaders in boardrooms across America, but she had never seen authority appear so quietly. She could not hear his words, yet somehow she felt their effect ripple through the room before anyone understood that the next few moments would change every life standing inside that grocery store. Nobody screamed. Not at first. Fear rarely arrived with noise. It arrived with confusion, with uncertain glances, with people searching one another's faces for permission to panic. Victoria felt her pulse quicken as she tightened her grip around the basket in her hand. She had handled corporate crises worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet nothing in her career prepared her for the fragile uncertainty of ordinary people caught inside an unexpected moment. A cashier slowly lowered her hands from the register. An elderly couple stood perfectly still beside a display of canned soup. Somewhere near the produce section, a shopping cart rolled forward on its own before gently bumping into a shelf. The entire store seemed to be holding a single breath. Elijah remained exactly where he was. He did not move toward the entrance. He did not move away from it, either. Instead, he knelt beside Caleb until they were eye level. "Look at me," he said softly. "Do not watch anything else. Just listen to my voice." Caleb locked onto his father's eyes without hesitation. Elijah smiled with the same calm expression he had worn while teaching his son how to count dollar bills only moments earlier. Slow breath in. Slow breath out. Good. Again. The little boy copied every movement. Within seconds, his shoulders relaxed. Victoria watched in disbelief. The calm surrounding the child spread farther than she expected. A young mother standing only a few feet away noticed Elijah's steady rhythm and quietly encouraged her own daughter to breathe the same way. Another customer lowered his trembling shoulders after seeing that the child was no longer frightened. Nothing dramatic happened. No speeches. No commands. Just one father refusing to let fear become contagious. Elijah's eyes quietly scanned the front of the store. He noticed every checkout lane, every customer, every employee. Years of solving ordinary problems had taught him that people often overlook the smallest details during stressful moments. Near Register 4, a cashier named Emily pressed one hand against her chest. Her breathing had become noticeably uneven. She reached beneath the counter with shaking fingers, but stopped halfway, unable to steady herself. Elijah recognized the signs immediately. His younger sister had lived with asthma for years. Panic only made breathing harder. Without attracting attention, he leaned slightly toward the woman standing beside him. "There is an inhaler under the counter," he whispered gently. "Slide it closer to her when you can. Slowly. No sudden movements." The woman blinked at him, surprised that someone else had noticed. She nodded almost imperceptibly. A few careful seconds later, the small inhaler reached Emily's hand. She inhaled once, then again. Color slowly returned to her face. Victoria saw the entire exchange from across the aisle. Elijah never looked around to see whether anyone admired him. He simply checked that the cashier's breathing had steadied before turning his attention back to Caleb. "You are doing great," he whispered. "Keep breathing with me." Victoria realized something that unsettled her far more than the uncertainty surrounding them. Elijah was not trying to be the bravest person in the room. He was trying to make everyone else feel a little safer. There was an enormous difference, and somehow she had spent years surrounded by powerful people without ever meeting someone who understood it. Time slowed into something almost unreal. The store no longer felt like a place where people bought groceries on their way home from work. It had become a room full of strangers quietly deciding who they would be when life refused to follow the script. Victoria could hear the faint hum of the refrigerators along the back wall and the distant ticking of the clock above the customer service desk. Every ordinary sound suddenly felt important. Elijah rested one hand lightly on Caleb's shoulder and continued speaking with the same steady voice. "Remember what we practiced before your spelling test?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "When your heart starts racing, your mind needs one calm thing to hold on to." The boy took another slow breath. "Your voice," he answered. Elijah smiled. "Exactly." Victoria looked away for a moment, surprised by the tightness growing in her throat. She had spent years studying leadership seminars, executive coaching programs, and crisis management strategies, yet none of them had sounded as honest as a father helping his son feel safe with nothing more than patience. Then another detail caught Elijah's attention. Near the end of the checkout area, a little girl no older than 6 had become separated from the woman she had been standing beside. Tears filled the child's eyes as she looked around without recognizing a familiar face. She was not crying loudly. She looked overwhelmed, frozen by uncertainty. Elijah did not call out to her. He understood that loud voices could make frightened children retreat even further. Instead, he crouched slightly so that he appeared smaller rather than larger and gently rolled a bright red apple across the polished floor. It stopped only a few feet from the little girl. She blinked in confusion before carefully picking it up. "That apple looks like it needs a helper," Elijah said with a warm smile that never carried the slightest hint of pressure. "Do you think you could keep it safe for me until all of this is over?" The girl's tiny hands wrapped around the apple. She nodded almost automatically. Her breathing slowed. She looked at the apple instead of everything else surrounding her. Victoria watched the simple exchange in disbelief. Elijah had redirected the child's attention without making her feel embarrassed or frightened. Moments later, the woman searching desperately for the little girl spotted her and quietly moved closer, relief washing across her face without a single dramatic word. Elijah simply nodded once before returning his attention to Caleb. He never waited for thanks. He never looked around to see who had noticed. Victoria found herself studying him instead. His work jacket was worn. His shoes carried the marks of long days spent repairing equipment. Nothing about him suggested wealth, influence, or social status. Yet everyone within a few yards of him seemed calmer than before. She suddenly understood that authority did not always come from a corner office or an expensive suit. Sometimes it came from someone who knew how to protect another person's peace without asking for anything in return. For the first time in years, Victoria questioned whether she had spent too much of her life admiring confidence while overlooking quiet character, because the man standing across the checkout lane possessed a kind of strength that could never be measured on a balance sheet. The longer the silence lasted, the more people expected someone to lose control. Instead, Elijah quietly proved that calm could be just as contagious as fear. He glanced toward Caleb again and offered a reassuring nod. "Keep looking at me," he said. "Do not let your eyes chase what cannot help you." Caleb obeyed immediately. Victoria found herself doing the same without realizing it. Her attention drifted away from the uncertainty around the entrance and settled on the steady rhythm of Elijah's voice. It was almost unsettling how naturally she trusted him, despite never having met him before that evening. Nearby, a teenage grocery clerk struggled to keep his breathing steady. His hands shook so noticeably that a bottle of orange juice slipped from the edge of a cooler and rolled across the floor. The unexpected sound caused several customers to flinch. Elijah reacted before panic could spread. Without raising his voice, he smiled gently toward the young employee. "Accidents happen," he said. "The bottle is only trying to find a better parking spot." A few nervous smiles appeared despite the tension. Even the teenager let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. The atmosphere shifted by only a fraction, but sometimes a fraction was enough. Elijah understood that frightened minds searched desperately for normal moments. Give people one ordinary thought, and they could remember who they were before fear arrived. His eyes continued scanning the room with patient precision. Every face told a different story. A grandfather silently held his wife's hand. A college student stared at the floor, whispering a prayer under her breath. A delivery driver gently pushed his shopping cart away so it would not block the aisle. None of them knew each other, yet they were suddenly connected by the same uncertain moment. Elijah quietly spoke again, not to everyone, but loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Keep your attention on the people beside you. Help them stay calm. Fear grows when it feels alone." The words spread farther than anyone expected. The elderly man squeezed his wife's hand a little tighter. The college student looked up and offered a reassuring smile to the cashier beside her. The delivery driver nodded toward another customer, as if silently reminding him they would get through this together. Victoria felt something shift deep inside her. Every leadership conference she had ever attended focused on commanding attention. Elijah was doing the exact opposite. He was giving attention away. He was making every frightened person feel seen instead of making himself the center of the moment. She realized that true leadership might not begin with authority at all. It might begin with generosity. Then Caleb looked up at his father with complete trust. "Dad," he whispered. Elijah answered immediately. "Yes, buddy." The little boy swallowed before asking, "Are we going to be okay?" Elijah never hesitated. He placed one warm hand over his son's shoulder and smiled with complete certainty. "We already are," he said softly, "because we are taking care of each other." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief second. She had spent years believing success meant staying ahead of everyone else. Yet one ordinary father standing in a neighborhood grocery store had just shown her a different definition of strength. It was not about controlling a crisis. It was about protecting the humanity inside it. The tension finally began to loosen, not because anyone inside the store had done something dramatic, but because the uncertainty that had filled every corner was slowly giving way to relief. Outside, the faint sound of approaching sirens drifted through the parking lot, followed by calm voices directing people to remain where they were for just a few more moments. Employees exchanged exhausted glances. Customers slowly exhaled breaths they did not realize they had been holding. Someone quietly thanked heaven. Someone else simply closed their eyes. Elijah did not celebrate. He looked at Caleb first. "You did exactly what we practiced," he said, brushing a loose strand of hair away from the boy's forehead. "I am proud of you." Caleb smiled with the quiet confidence only children carry after hearing those words from a parent they completely trust. "I was scared," the boy admitted. Elijah nodded. "Being scared is never the problem. Forgetting how to care for people because you are scared is." Caleb thought about that for a second before reaching into the shopping basket and handing the bright red apple back to the little girl who had protected it. "I think this belongs to you now," he said. The little girl hugged the apple against her sweater as though it were something precious instead of ordinary fruit. Her mother looked at Elijah with grateful eyes that struggled to find the right words. Elijah simply smiled and shook his head gently, letting her know that no explanation was necessary. Victoria stood only a few feet away, watching every small exchange. She had expected applause. She had expected people to gather around Elijah and call him a hero. Instead, something much quieter unfolded. A store employee began helping an elderly customer collect groceries that had tipped out of a reusable bag. A teenager picked up scattered receipts near the checkout lane. Someone returned an abandoned shopping cart to its proper place. It was as though Elijah's calm had reminded everyone that kindness was still possible, even after fear had visited the room. Without saying a word, Elijah bent down and gathered a box of oatmeal, a loaf of bread, and several cans of soup that had rolled beneath a display shelf. He carefully placed each item back into another customer's basket before collecting his own groceries. Victoria could hardly believe what she was seeing. After everything that had happened, he was still thinking about strangers before himself. One of the responding officers approached him with a respectful expression. "Sir, we may need a brief statement before you leave." Elijah nodded politely. "Of course, whatever helps." There was no pride in his voice, no excitement about being noticed, only quiet cooperation. While the officer stepped away to speak with another employee, Victoria noticed Elijah adjusting Caleb's jacket and checking whether his shoelaces had come undone. That simple gesture affected her more deeply than anything else she had witnessed that evening. Here was a man who had carried peace into a room filled with uncertainty, yet the first thing he did afterward was make sure his son was warm and comfortable. Victoria suddenly understood why she could not stop watching him. It was not because he had done something extraordinary. It was because he had remained ordinary in the most extraordinary way, refusing to let one difficult evening change the gentle person he had already chosen to become. The next morning, Seattle woke beneath a blanket of low gray clouds, but Victoria Hayes could not leave the previous evening behind. She arrived at headquarters before 7 o'clock, carrying her usual black coffee, yet she barely touched it. Instead of reviewing financial reports waiting on her desk, she opened the security footage that had already been forwarded from the grocery store. She watched the recording once, then again, then a third time. Every replay revealed something she had missed before. Elijah never pushed himself into the center of attention. He never looked for approval. While everyone else focused on the uncertainty surrounding them, he focused on individual people. The frightened cashier, the little girl with the apple, his own son. Every decision seemed guided by one simple question. Who needs calm the most right now? Victoria paused the video at the exact moment Elijah smiled at Caleb. There was nothing extraordinary about the image. A father, a son, a quiet smile. Yet it carried more authority than speeches she had heard from executives earning millions of dollars each year. She leaned back in her chair, surprised by the realization that she could remember quarterly profit margins more easily than the names of half the people working in her own building. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Her executive assistant, Lauren, stepped inside carrying the morning schedule. "Your investor meeting begins in 30 minutes, she said. Victoria nodded absent-mindedly before turning the monitor slightly. "Lauren, can you help me identify someone?" Lauren studied the paused image. "The gentleman from the grocery store?" Victoria looked up, surprised. "You saw the news?" Lauren smiled softly. The local station mentioned how several customers stayed remarkably calm because of one father who kept reassuring everyone around him. They never shared his name. Victoria looked back at the screen. "I want to thank him." Lauren hesitated. "Most people would probably send flowers or a gift card." Victoria slowly shook her head. "That does not feel right." She understood why almost immediately. Elijah had not acted out of generosity because he expected a reward. Offering money would reduce something deeply human into a transaction. "Can we identify him through the store manager?" she asked. Lauren made a quick note. "I will start making calls." By lunchtime, the answer arrived. Elijah Bennett worked as a senior maintenance technician for a commercial heating and cooling company on the south side of the city. He had been with the same employer for nearly 12 years. No public awards, no military background, no viral interviews. Just a steady employment record and excellent recommendations from every supervisor who had worked with him. Victoria read the short report twice. The simplicity of it fascinated her. There was no hidden fortune, no secret celebrity, no dramatic history waiting to surprise the world. He was simply a man who had quietly practiced kindness for so long that it had become part of his character. Victoria closed the folder and stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle. For years she had searched for extraordinary people in extraordinary places. Somehow she had overlooked the possibility that the most remarkable person she would ever meet might spend his mornings repairing broken air conditioning systems before driving home to help his son with homework. Late that Friday afternoon, Victoria left her downtown office without the usual convoy of assistants or security personnel following behind her. She drove herself across the city, passing glass towers that slowly gave way to warehouses, repair shops, and small family-owned businesses where people measured success one honest day's work at a time. The address Lauren had found led her to a modest commercial heating and cooling company tucked beside a railroad crossing. Service trucks lined the parking lot, each carrying years of scratches that spoke more about hard work than appearance. Inside the open garage, the steady sound of tools echoed against concrete floors while technicians finished the last repairs before the weekend. Victoria spotted Elijah almost immediately. He stood beside an aging rooftop air conditioning unit that had been lowered onto a work platform. His sleeves were rolled above his forearms, and his attention rested entirely on explaining something to a younger apprentice who listened with complete concentration. Elijah never touched the equipment before asking the apprentice what he thought first. "Tell me what you notice," he said. "Do not worry about being wrong. Start with what you can see." The apprentice carefully pointed toward a worn fan motor. Elijah smiled. "Good. You trusted your eyes before your assumptions." Victoria remained near the entrance for several moments, watching a kind of leadership she had rarely witnessed inside expensive conference rooms. Elijah corrected mistakes without embarrassment. He praised effort before results. Every person working beside him looked relaxed enough to ask questions instead of pretending to know every answer. Finally, one of the technicians noticed the elegantly dressed woman standing quietly by the door and called Elijah's name. He turned, wiped his hands on a clean shop towel, and walked toward her with the same calm expression she remembered from the grocery store. Recognition appeared in his eyes almost immediately. "You were there the other night," he said warmly. Victoria nodded. "I was." Elijah extended his hand without hesitation. "I am glad you made it home safely." Those simple words caught her completely off guard. She had expected him to ask why she was there or how she had found him. Instead, his first concern was whether she had been all right. "I actually came to thank you," she replied. "Not just for me. For everyone." Elijah smiled modestly. "I do not think I did anything special." Victoria let out a quiet laugh. "That may be the biggest difference between us. I think you did." She reached into her purse and removed an envelope she had prepared that morning. "Please accept this. It is only a small gesture of appreciation." Elijah glanced at the envelope, but made no move to take it. He looked back at Victoria with the same gentle eyes Caleb had trusted without question. "May I ask what is inside?" he said. "A financial gift," Victoria answered honestly. "I wanted to say thank you in a meaningful way." Elijah slowly shook his head. "I appreciate your kindness more than you know, but if I accepted money for helping people, my son might someday believe kindness has a price. I cannot teach him that." Victoria lowered the envelope without realizing she was doing it. She searched for an argument, but found none. Elijah had declined politely, without judgment, without pride, and somehow, without making her feel rejected. For the first time in a very long while, someone had reminded Victoria that the most valuable things in life could never be purchased, only practiced. Victoria drove home that evening with the unopened envelope resting on the passenger seat beside her. She did not feel embarrassed that Elijah had refused the money. She felt educated. Somewhere between the repair shop and the freeway, she realized she had spent years solving problems by writing larger checks when what many people truly needed was respect, trust, and someone willing to listen. The following Monday, she asked Lauren to rearrange the executive leadership meeting. "I want to invite someone to speak to the senior management team," she said. Lauren glanced at the calendar. "A consultant?" Victoria smiled slightly. "Not exactly." 2 days later, Elijah walked into Hayes Logistics headquarters wearing a freshly pressed blue button-down shirt, dark jeans, and polished work boots. He looked comfortable, not because the building impressed him, but because he carried the same quiet confidence everywhere he went. Employees looked up with polite curiosity as Victoria personally greeted him in the lobby. That alone surprised everyone. Senior executives were accustomed to clients, investors, and politicians receiving that kind of welcome. A maintenance technician was something entirely different. Victoria led Elijah into the executive conference room, where 12 department heads waited around a long walnut table. Charts filled the presentation screens. Quarterly projections covered every folder. Elijah quietly studied the room before taking the empty chair Victoria had reserved beside her. "Thank you for coming," she said. Elijah nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." One executive finally asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. "Mrs. Hayes mentioned you have experience with crisis management. Have you worked in emergency response?" Elijah smiled gently. "No, sir." Another executive leaned forward. "Military?" "No." "Law enforcement?" "No." A brief silence settled over the room. Victoria simply folded her hands and waited. Elijah looked around the table before speaking. "May I ask all of you a question instead?" Curious faces nodded. When people become afraid at work, what usually happens first? Several answers came immediately. Productivity drops. Communication fails. Mistakes increase. People stop trusting one another. Elijah listened to every response before quietly saying, "Fear does something even earlier than that. It convinces people they are alone." The room fell silent. Nobody reached for a notebook. Nobody checked a phone. Elijah continued without raising his voice. "Most leaders believe they must have the fastest answers. I think people first need someone who helps them breathe long enough to remember they already have good judgment." Victoria watched her executives more than she watched Elijah. One by one, shoulders relaxed. Defensive expressions softened. Even the chief financial officer, who rarely agreed with anyone, leaned back thoughtfully instead of preparing another objection. Elijah never mentioned the grocery store. He never described himself as courageous. Instead, he shared simple stories about raising Caleb, helping new apprentices learn without fear of making mistakes, and the importance of correcting people without taking away their dignity. "When people feel safe," he said quietly, "they think more clearly. When they think more clearly, they usually discover the solution together." Victoria looked around the room and realized something extraordinary had happened. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, nobody was competing to sound like the smartest person in the meeting. They were simply listening. And somehow, a man who repaired heating and cooling systems had quietly repaired something far more important inside the culture of her company. Weeks passed, yet the effect of that single afternoon refused to fade. Small changes quietly began appearing throughout Hayes Logistics. Managers spent more time walking the warehouse floors instead of staying behind office doors. Team meetings started with questions instead of directives. Employee turnover slowed for the first time in nearly 3 years. Nobody referred to it as the Elijah effect, but Victoria recognized it. Immediately, she had not brought a maintenance technician into the company to improve performance metrics. She had invited a good man into the room, and somehow the numbers improved because people felt respected again. Then, one rainy Wednesday morning, Lauren entered Victoria's office carrying an expression she had never worn before. "There has been an accident," she said softly. "One of our distribution centers is in complete lockdown. A school bus broke down beside the employee entrance during the storm. The children have been moved inside the warehouse while emergency crews clear the road, but everyone is frightened. Parents are calling nonstop. Managers are arguing over procedures. Nobody can calm the situation." Victoria stood immediately. Her first instinct was to gather lawyers, security directors, and public relations advisors. Then she stopped halfway to the door. A different voice echoed quietly inside her memory. "When people become afraid, they first believe they are alone." She reached for her phone instead. Elijah answered after the second ring. "Good morning, Victoria." She smiled despite the tension. "How did you know it was me?" He chuckled softly. "You only call during business hours." She took a slow breath. "I need your advice." She explained the situation carefully. Elijah never interrupted. When she finished, there was a brief silence before he spoke. "Are the children safe?" "Yes." "Are the employees safe?" "Yes." "Then the biggest problem is probably not danger anymore. It is uncertainty." Victoria closed her eyes. She realized he was right. "What should I do?" she asked quietly. Elijah answered without hesitation. "Go there. Put away your title for 1 hour. Sit with the children. Talk to the parents. Let your managers see you listening before they see you leading. Calm people make better decisions than frightened people. 45 minutes later, Victoria walked into the distribution center wearing a rain jacket instead of a business suit. She spent the next hour sitting on the warehouse floor beside children coloring on cardboard boxes while worried parents gradually relaxed around them. Managers stopped arguing because there was nothing left to prove. They simply worked together. By late afternoon, every child had safely returned home, every employee had resumed work, and every parent left knowing someone had genuinely cared. That evening, Victoria stood alone outside the warehouse as the rain finally stopped. She looked across the parking lot and quietly called Elijah once more. "You never came," she said. "You did not need me," he replied warmly. "You already knew what to do." Victoria smiled toward the clearing sky. For years, she believed great leaders changed companies with bold decisions. One quiet father had taught her something far greater. The strongest people were not the ones who controlled every room they entered. They were the ones who made everyone else feel safe enough to become the best version of themselves. And that kind of kindness never needed applause because its greatest victory was always the life it quietly changed.